So it is Steve G. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here. I never ask people to pronounce my surname when they introduce me. It's too hard. Yeah. So, look, it's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me. Dion rang me up and said, Steve, can you come and talk at this launch we're doing? I said, what would you like me to talk about, Dion? And he said, oh, you know, just ramble on a bit. So here I am. I'm going to ramble on a bit. I'm actually going to talk about my journey to becoming the Indigenous champion in defence. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you a bit about myself. And the first thing is, I'm a very keen rower, or sculler, in fact. And I'm often out on the lake in the morning at the crack of dawn, thrashing myself up and down the water there. And often stop at about the time of sunrise and just have a look. And as the sun rises over the water and the hills out to the west get illuminated, it's a sort of surreal experience to be just bobbing there in the middle of the lake on your own, almost spiritual, you'd say. And I reflect on those Ngunnawal folks that wandered into this region, you know, tens of thousands of years ago and decided they were going to live here. And I thought, wow, what a smart bunch of people they must have been. Good river supply, plenty of water, varied country, a lot of options for shelter. So acknowledge those folks, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So on to me. People often say, they ask me two questions. Steve, how did you become a Deputy Secretary in Defence? And sometimes, how did you become the Indigenous champion? And I always start my answer by saying, well, you have to fail school and be born overseas, which is how I started life. So I arrived here in 2001, knowing really very little about Australia, and particularly nothing about the sort of Indigenous heritage and history of Australia. I had seen Crocodile Dundee, which I thought was an excellent film, and I thought, well, that's, you know, I know a bit about what goes on here because I've seen that film, and I still watch it occasionally, it's very funny. But, you know, didn't really know much about the Indigenous history or culture, and to be honest, for the first few years I was here, didn't really pay much attention. I lived in Canberra, trying to get kids through school, trying to get my job going properly, all of those pressures that are in your daily life. And so I didn't pay much attention at all. Fast forward to about 2014, when I'd been the Deputy Secretary for just a little while, and Dennis Richardson, who was our Secretary, rang me up one day and said, Steve, I've been invited to go on this Jarwin thing up in the north, but I can't go, so you go instead. And of course, when the Secretary asks you if you'd like to go somewhere, saying no is usually not an option. So off I went on a 3-day Jarwin executive program in Far North Queensland. Now, for those of you, probably most of you know about Jarwin, but it's a program where we send people to go and live and work in Indigenous communities for a period of time and contribute their skills to help grow capability, but also send senior executives from the public sector and industry out to a range of places so they can learn about what goes on and get their companies involved in helping. A very successful program. So up I went up to the far north, and the first thing that happened was we met a chap called Noel Pearson, who I sort of knew about, but obviously had never met before. And Noel gave us a presentation and talked about what he's trying to do. And I know he can be a polarising character at times, but what he's trying to do with his Cape York partnership up there is generate employment opportunities for Indigenous people. And he told a powerful story, which I could never hope to tell in the same way, but a very powerful story about, in his own story, when he was trying to work out how to help, what could he do? This goes back quite a long time ago. And he was out talking to communities up in far north Queensland. And he said he was in one of his community consultation sessions trying to work out what we should do. And he said, a senior elder, a woman, said to him, Noel, you just got to get our kids off that welfare pedestal. Get them a job, give them a reason to look forward to a better life, something they can engage in. And the way Noel talked about it was so powerful. And then we spent the next 2 days visiting places. So went to places like Arakoon, way up in far north Queensland. A place with about 1,000 people from about 4 different Indigenous clans, where almost nobody has a job. And most of the jobs are done by white folks who've been imported to be the teachers at the schools or be the police force or whatever. And I have to say, walking down the main street of Arakoon, where only a couple of months later there was rioting in the streets, I found a scary experience. And I thought, wow, I'm in Australia. this is a first world country, but I feel like I'm in the third world. How can we let this be? So you start asking questions of yourself then. The question I asked myself was, well, what could I do? What could I possibly do to make any difference to this process? And it became, I just thought about it for a few weeks, and it suddenly occurred to me that we spent a lot of money. And what Noel Pearson had said was exactly right. How do we get our young people into meaningful jobs and employment so they can see a future where they can contribute in that way, still be connected to country in the traditional ways, but contribute through business and industry. And at that time, in my world, in defence, the non-material procurement team existed, which Siobhan is now part of. It now lives in CASG, having been moved there after first principles review. And I started talking to my folks in that team and saying, well, what do we do with Indigenous companies, if there are any? And we had a look, and Defence had spent $2,000 with Indigenous companies in the year of 2014, and was doing way better than most Commonwealth entities at $2,000. So I said, well, could we do something around, trying to get these companies more into the supply chain? And so we started a process. And we discovered PM&C at the time were thinking about the IPP and starting to develop it, and so we actually helped. Some of my folks helped PM&C help write that policy. And we discovered quite quickly that there was a lot of Indigenous business out there, there was a lot of opportunity, and all you had to do as a senior leader was sort of shine a light on the issue and make it quite clear you were vaguely interested in doing more of this sort of stuff. And I found that my teams were incredibly responsive. And I've never, I never yell at them at all. It's just demonstrating that you are interested in this subject, and people rise to the challenge. So that went on for a little while, and Siobhan talks about the numbers, and the number of contracts we placed just kept going up and up. We beat all of the targets that PM&C ever set for us. In fact, whenever you beat a target, and the Prime Minister's Department always makes it harder next year, that's fine. But we kept beating those targets. But it's really, in defence now, it's not about targets. I say to my teams, the targets are interesting, don't worry about them, just get out there and engage Indigenous business. We don't drive ourselves by the target. We don't say, oh, I've got the target, you can stop now till next year. We just keep driving on. So targets are interesting, but I've got no actual real interest in them. Anyway, fast forward a couple of years, and most of the work we were doing was in my space. So it was facilities management, small-scale building works, that sort of thing. And we wondered how we could, if you like, move up the food chain in a technology sense. How could we get more complex, more demanding, more technically, we call it STEM sort of employment. And I found myself sat, oddly enough, at an ASPI conference. Peter would have been there. It must have been around 2016. It was a very odd experience for me, because it was an ASPI conference, lots of people. It was about strategic stuff, and it was in the wake of the 2016 white paper, so it would have been somewhere around 2016. And there's all sorts of interesting speakers talking about strategy, the Indo-Pacific, all of that interesting stuff, and me. And so I talked about what we do, and Warren King was in the audience, and Warren King asked me a question, which was a Dorothy Dixer, I have to say. And the question was, Steve, how are you going with engaging Indigenous business? And the audience, imagine the audience, it's Naval Group, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Raytheon, etc., etc. And so I told them a story which was told to me by a couple of Indigenous people who were starting to think about creating an Indigenous company to leverage Indigenous suppliers into the technical end of the defence supply chain. And they came to me and they said, Steve, we'd like to build ships. So that's interesting. What sort of ships do you want to build? Well, warships for the Australian Defence Force. I said, great. There's a lot of companies out there that think they can build ships as well, and they've built them in the past. And they said, actually, we don't want to build ships this year, and we don't want to build ships in the next decade. We don't really want to build ships in the decade after that, but the decade after that, we want to build ships. And we want to build them in Australia with an Indigenous company. I said, keep talking, that's very interesting. And they said, did you know, Steve, that the National Broadband Network, and I have to caveat this is a 2016 truism, thankfully not true anymore, that the NBN has spent billions of dollars rolling out the NBN and hasn't placed a single contract with an Indigenous-owned company. And I looked it up, and that was true. So at the ASPI conference, having been asked by Dixer, I started telling this story, And I went further and I said, wouldn't it be a tragedy, you guys, industry, wouldn't it be a tragedy if, in 30 years' time, someone like me stands on a stage and says, you know what, we just built a fleet of frigates, a fleet of submarines, a fleet of offshore patrol vessels, and nobody placed any contracts with Indigenous-owned companies as part of that process. Adam Goods, who is now on my, I've got his phone number, we exchange messages every now and again, lovely chap. Adam Goods says to me, Steve, what did you say in that conference? Because all of a sudden, I mentioned a couple of names of the people that had been talking to me about this, and all of a sudden they're deluged with Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Raytheon, others. How can we get involved? How can we get involved? There's now a thing called the Indigenous Defence and Infrastructure Consortium, which Adam Goods is the CEO of, or the chair. And it was the people who now run that corporation that were talking to me about this story about the NBN. So, and they don't want to build ships this year, or next decade, or the decade after, but they want to start getting into the supply chain. They want to start growing small businesses in those more technical areas who can be part of the supply chain and grow themselves over a couple of generations, if we're honest. We're looking at 40 years worth here. And who knows down the track, the replacement for the Hunter-class frigate program, who knows? Why couldn't they be built by an Indigenous-owned company that knows how to build ships? Anyway, so that's the sort of story around that, and that's really all I was going to talk about. It's interesting in defence. We've actually been on this journey for quite a long time. The first big win we had was in 2003, which of course I couldn't take any credit for, way before my time. In 2003, in the Northern Territory, Defence signed an Indigenous land use agreement with the Bradshaw Company, or the people up there, and they created a company called the Bradshaw Company, which was originally looked at our Bradshaw training range. And we started working with that company to give them work on the training range. So the first thing they did was put some fences up for us back in 2003. Well, by now, it's a company of 20 permanent employees, about 50 people who work for the company as and when the work's available. They're winning work with the Northern Territory government, they're winning work with the local councils in the Bradshaw area, and they're thriving, self-sufficient, they have apprentices, and they're doing good works for us. So that was the first thing that Defence did. We do that now much more commonly. We've just signed another of those agreements in North Queensland with the mob around Charters Towers, and they're going to help us develop a new training area up in Greenvale. So there's great potential here, great opportunity. I just want to say thanks to ASPI and Dion for launching this STEM Pathways program. I think it's great. I think it's great that Defence is chipping money into it as well, and we'll be with you all the way. Thanks very much indeed.